Sorry about the delay. So this is the book. The next, okay, I will start the presentation. Okay, I don't see how to do that. So this is us. Fabian is the founder and managing director of market analysis in Brazil. Valerie is research associate in Jerusalem Institute for Policy Research, Israel, and also has many other functions that she will tell you herself. And Lei Zhang is from China, associate professor in the School of Environmental and Natural Sciences. And this is what we are going to do, a brief introduction from my side. Fabian talking about scenarios, Valerie about trends and the home and the city, Lei Zhang about the neighborhood and policies, and then I will have a few concluding remarks. So very briefly about the history. The four of us, together with a few others, met early last year in the beginning of the COVID epidemic. And we found out from each other that each of us was doing work in trying to understand the trends, the possibilities, and the questions, what the relationship between COVID and lifestyles is. Are we going to go back to normal after the epidemic is finished, or are there opportunities for opening up for new lifestyles in relation to sustainability and climate change? So we presented our first papers at the conference last year at the SCORAI conference, and from there it was a relatively easy step to move to a book. And this is the website of Routledge, where our book is presented. It is published about 2 months ago. I will now give the floor to Fabian for his presentation. And sorry for the confusion again. I will stop sharing my screen. And Fabian, you're next.
Thank you. Thank you, Philip. Thank you all for joining us in this new presentation. And we of course we will give a capsule form introduction to some of the contents of some of the chapters, and we will leave for the Q&A for trying to get a little more in detail about it. But pretty much for all the four of us, what was very clear, it was very clear when we started discussing about what could be the post-pandemic future like, where in connection to the triple shock of measures that were applied everywhere. The critical one is the public health emergency, which actually redefined the notion of health and even well-being. The economic recession that was implemented either through lockdowns or different levels of restrictions that had an impact on the financial states of people and the economic organization of society, and even on the fiscal health of the state. And the third mention of social isolation and physical distancing. So of course, the first reaction was for not just for us, but newspapers, magazines, academicians, and professionals in the public and private sector, is how practices, how behavior, how routines will be disrupted for this, because there was a certainty about the disruption that this will bring. And it could bring, and this had a particular feature of disrupting behaviors before changing any values. And so it's one particular case in where you don't need that basis of attitudes or beliefs or behaviors or values before anticipating, shaping the dispositions of behaviors to change as a second step. We placed two main questions then. What were the trends that result as effects of this this disruption, and we identified accelerated trends, a reversal in other trends that were already occurring in society, and some innovation, some surprises that took the form of a trend, of a pattern, of a development of how things, how practices, how routines, how ways to act will be shaped from now on. And out of that, it certainly was a question about how the future will look like, and what sort of scenarios, of situations, or hypothetical segments of behaviors one could identify as a result of this triple shock. And the first way to think about it in a very simplistic but very persuasive was to put it in terms of going back to an old normal after all this, the crisis is gone, or the rise of a new normal. And we certainly perceive through the trends and through how home, cities, communities, and policies were changing, that there was a case for sketching out a new normal. Very quickly, we know that the old normal had serious challenges for sustainability, but there were some positive, or at least some optimistic trends in terms, at least, of the sustainable development goals that that were taken as a benchmark. So for example, related to the first goal of zero poverty or no poverty or poverty reduction, before COVID-19, there were slow reductions in poverty, even though inequalities were sustained. Well, after COVID, and particularly from the global South perspective, what we have is that there were immense increases in poverty, so a reversal in the trend that we were heading before, with even greater inequalities. So and some of the social levels, we can see that the situation has gotten worse. Initially, related to the environmental quality of the post-COVID scenario, we were having some optimism related mostly to clear skies, lower level of pollution, lower level of emissions. So there were some benevolent view related to how COVID was impacting, and something that now we cannot take it for granted, and probably will require some follow-up to get the actual balance of that situation. So very quickly, about trends, and very quickly, because these trends take body or are more clearly situated in relation to what happened to home, to what happened to communities, to what happened in cities, which are the discussions that Valerie and Lei will bring after my talk. So what we have here is that major accelerations in terms of how digitalization permeates different dimensions of life, how consumption bring together considerations related to the environment, to our own health, to the ethics of production, and to a defense of local interest, or a return to defending some of the country or region when one's belong. Some of the interests intrinsic to the production of some of these items to be consumed. The deceleration of some other trends, such as the ones that I illustrated with the reversal of some of the SDGs, but also in terms of the reversal of the sharing and circular economy, of the reduction in throwaway mentality that was in vigor before COVID, and some of these surprises that will be better illustrated by my co-authors. In terms of scenarios, and as an exercise of also understanding how trends will have impact lifestyles, we recognized 12 different domains of practice, of dimensions of life that were relevant, but in particular 2 that were specifically impacted, or more heavily impacted, by scarcity. And scarcity in terms of changing the patterns, the volumes, the goals in which these activities were performed, or in which these dimensions where different activities are performed were hit. And of course, scarcity is something that critically redefines priorities, redefines values, because it affects our needs and our wants. So the two dimensions that more critically were reshaped were the ones related to social relations, to socializing, to social contact, and the other one related to what we consume, and not just in terms of what we acquire, but what we use and how we dispose. Out of this, out of these 2 macro variables or dimensions of lives, in order to foresee scenarios or segments of how activities will be performed, we envision extreme opposite potential hypothetical responses. So in terms of social connection, for a post-pandemic horizon, we understood that there could be 2 extreme hypothetical reactions from society. One going into a sort of social diving response, and the opposite will be the one that where virtuality or virtual life or digitalized life will be fully internalized. Same deal with consumption. We build scenarios in a way that some of the social sciences does, using this type of ideal types of responses, thinking about one extreme that could be a trend toward consumer revenge, and the opposite, a trend toward accepting a post-material, frugal, sufficient, self-sufficient lifestyle. So to put it more in clear conceptual terms, the consumer revenge will imply a radical return to how things were, to previous behaviors, to previous reactions in relation to consumption, mostly driven by the repressed consumption during lockdown period, the delayed gratification, the need to compensate for that, which will bring us back to all patterns of conspicuous consumption and using material things to identify to others who we are, and use that as a basis for social interchanges. Where the post-material frugality hypothesis as an opposite reaction will be a recognition that some of the COVID restrictions, COVID-driven restrictions had payoff beyond the use of materials or possessions or experiences of consumption. So it will raise values of frugality and sufficiency, and will automatically imply the abandonment of status markers, of identity references, based on material goods. Whereas at the level of social connection, the social diving response would imply rushing into again into a sort of compensation for the delayed time in experiencing social connections, social interchanges, social relationships. So it's a way to compensate for the lack of opportunity for some in some societies for 1.5 years, probably for other society for longer than that.
Fabian, you have 1 minute left. Okay, you have
sure.
1 minute. 1 minute left. Sure. Thank you.
So for the lack of opportunities to identify and feel identified to others and belong to others, whereas the virtualization, the internalization of virtual life will imply assimilating, acclimatizing to having your activities done remotely, even if that means loneliness or some lower sense or weaker sense of belonging, because the benefits of privacy, intimacy, comfort, convenience are deemed as higher. So we come up with 4 scenarios out of that, or 4 segments of in terms of how activities could be, or how lifestyles could be displayed. On the convergence of social diving and consumer revenge response, we call it the back to normal type scenarios, where social diving matches the post-material frugality response. We call it the gregarious simplifier scenarios, where virtuality internalized goes with a consumer revenge response. We call it material wireless materialists, and we lay click rebels on the 4th category, 4 scenarios. One quick example will be that, for example, the level of mobility, each one will respond very differently. So in the back to normal scenarios, individualized car-based transportation will again be a paradigm of and also a way to show status to others. In the gregarious simplifiers scenario, what we have as a way of mobility is basically non-car dependent or sharing car alternatives. In the click rebel scenario, where remote life mediated through internet and apps, with the post-material frugality approach, it will be about micromobility means with a strong endorsement of self-driving cars. In the last scenarios of wireless materialism, it will be, well, by definition, they will try to avoid mobility because they will remain at home and trying to do everything digitally. So each scenario has a different story to tell us for each of those other domains of lives that we explore. And having said that, I'll give floor to my colleagues. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Fabian. And without further ado, we move on to Valerie Brachia from Israel. Valerie, the floor is yours. You have 7 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to go straight to share screen, and I hope we'll get there all right. Okay, my part of the story as a policymaker and an urban planner was to say, what are the implications this is going to have on where we live, how we live, on the city, on the home, and how we're going to spend our leisure time, and what kind of travel circulation patterns will we need to provide. And looking at what had happened prior to our COVID experience, we were actually on some more sustainable trends. If we're looking at urban revitalization. We were getting high density living with smaller apartments. We were getting a lot of improvement in public transport. People were out on the streets enjoying open space, commercial space, liveliness. Life in the city was very lively, with entertainment, cafes, bars, street life, especially for young people in city centers. And as urban people, we saw that as a positive trend towards more sustainability. And the COVID knocked that all out. It sent us all into the home, and we were looking at how we can manage within the home. We stopped using public transport, and we stopped being on the streets. We stopped gathering, and young people, even from the center of cities, lively places, quite a number of them actually went back to their parents' home because they couldn't afford to stay, and they lost their jobs. So from a point of view looking at COVID, although some environmentalists looked at it as positive, I would suggest that urban sustainability point of view, it was negative. And then the question is that going to stay with us? And I was looking at our book, we submitted it at the end of 2020. And I was looking at what happened actually in 2021 now with the vaccinations rolling out everywhere. And it seems that there are two directions that are happening in practice. One is that post-vaccination, people are coming together again and are the social divers, as Fabian would say. People want to go back to social events. People want to be together. We're social animals. We want to be together. We want to be out on the streets. We want to be in restaurants and bars. So from that point of view, we can see post-vaccination, we're going back to social activity, and social distancing is not going to stay. But if we're looking at a very major impact on what will happen post-corona, a very major trend that Fabian already mentioned is digitalization. And the digitalization, it sent us to working remote, retail remote, entertainment remote, everything. The education was remote for a time. And that is something which jumped forward, accelerated forward in an enormous way, and that is not going to go back. So if we look at the most recent Ipsos survey asking people, do you expect to work more from home post-demic? The answer is very definitely yes. About 50% of people in many countries were working remote during the COVID. OECD expects at least 30% to be working remote in continuation. Online retail is not going to go back, it's going to go forward. And online entertainment is here to stay with gaming, and people are not necessarily going back to cinemas to watch films. So the question is, what's sticky? What's going to stay with us? What will stay permanently? What will return? And how will a new normal affect the ways we live? And it's going to be hybrid. Is that more or less sustainable? Well, some things are and some things are not. What's going to happen to homes? People took all their activities into home. We had to live in the home. We had to do everything in the home. So people started looking at how they can use their home in this multiple use way and make it more flexible. But many people started looking for bigger homes, moving out. They also wanted a garden, a balcony somewhere outside. So we started having the developers already caught on very quickly and said, you want a larger home, you want to go out of town, you don't need to commute all the time. So there's definitely been a change in the property market and in the way we use our homes. And if we want the homes to remain urban, then we have to find better ways of multiple use and shared space inside the home. One of the directions which has really caught on and is relevant is that people stayed in and around the home, that is in their neighborhoods. And we particularly stress the importance of neighborhoods and neighborhood life. That was the idea of the 15-minute city by Carlos Moreno. It was adopted by the mayor of Paris. And it's very much a strong theme today. We live in neighborhoods. Some neighborhoods will benefit, some neighborhoods may lose. So what are we going to see in cities? We're going to see changes in the way that space is used in the city. We can expect decentralization and dispersal of activities. We already see a considerable reduce of demand for office space in the central business districts. Rents have been going down in city centers. We're seeing that there are increasing centers in neighborhoods, in the outer suburbs of neighborhoods. People have moved out to get affordable and higher quality housing. So their centers in small towns are increasing. And some people are moving to rural remote working hubs, which are much further out. So we are seeing a difference in the way that people are reviewing and assessing their needs for homes and the way it'll affect cities. And one of the ways it'll affect city would be the new normal mobility. What we actually have seen, in fact, in practice, is two very, very unsustainable trends. One is there has been a severe loss of public transport use, and it hasn't come back. If we look at the Google mobility community figures, people did not go back to public transport, have gone back very small way, not back to where they were before. And the second thing is we have an increasing amount of private car use with congestion. So that's what's happening. In fact, on the ground, that is a very bad trend. And if we're talking about more people moving out of town, then we may be getting longer distance commuting, and we may be getting a bad trend from that. Certainly in sustainability, we got increase in cycling and walking and perhaps micromobility. The one thing which offers a great hope is that digital highways replace the need for physical highways. So the most crucial item for people in choosing their home, their place, is to have a very high speed digital connectivity, the broadband, the optical system of where we had digital highways. And that became the most crucial issue and is one of the very crucial issues. Will it replace the need for the physical highways? So are we going to be in post-COVID more sustainable or less sustainable? If we talk in terms of there was lower personal consumption, fine, but there are governments who are promoting to revive the economy, are promoting increased personal expenditure. We may get less frequent community with remote working, but we're also getting some trends to longer community journeys from out of town and out of suburbs. So, well, are we going to get more or less sustainable? Well, it will depend on policies and the way in which national and local governments respond with their policies. So my last slide to you is to say what could be policies which are right for the new normal, but a sustainable new normal. And I would put it to you that the crucial one is to get broadband in the hub and internet hubs out to everybody as a public service everywhere, so that anybody everywhere, and it is not a differentiating factor between high income and low income, between center and periphery, everybody should have that as a public service. We're finding now that there are countries which are supporting remote working. There's a very interesting development in Ireland who are saying, let's go for remote work strategy with aiming for 20% of the public sector to be remote working during this year. We should certainly go for mixed uses and remove from the planners, the zoning and the land use separation. We want to mix together, bring residential into city areas, bring employment into residential and neighborhood areas. We need to revive the public transport as a decentralized system and get micro mobility. And the last point is the neighborhood development was an extraordinary important development with community for space and for communities, and that is going to be the theme that's taken up by my colleague now coming, Lei. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valerie. And the next speaker is Lei Zhang. And Lei, please, 7 minutes also for you.
Okay, thanks, Phillips. I will try.
In the meantime, while Lei is working on her share screen, please put your questions in the chat box. And there's already one question in the Q&A, but I prefer to have them in the chat box if you can. There.
Okay, I hope it's coming.
Go, Lei. Go ahead.
Yeah, great. Okay. Okay, dear colleagues, following the previous talks, I will be focusing on the role of state and the community. So one on the top, another one very much at the bottom. Basically, we are trying to
Lei,
find a
can
way
you
to
speak
manage.
closer to the microphone, please?
So you cannot hear?
Yeah, be a little bit closer, please.
Okay. And I will try to speed up, and so we have time for other things. Okay, basically, it's not a question to green or not to green, but how to green for all of us from the policy responses. Another one is why we focus on community governance as immediate context for lifestyle change, especially based on Chinese experiences. Before I move on, I just want to emphasize that to understand those policy responses or how communities are organized or governed, one has to put it in the context of institutional situations in a given country. But I don't have time to explain the situation in China. So in case you have questions, we can come back to this. So first, from the latest statistics, you see, yeah, economically, China is really recovering, and we are actually achieving for GDP growth rate more than 80%, as well as for consumption. So you see people are really buying. But behind this, there are a lot of things are at work. So from the state, if you check this kind of database, you see the general conclusion is so far, most of the governments are spending money for economic recovery. But if you look at those positive impacts in terms of environment and climate, it's only about 17% of the total expenditures. We can call it green. If you go into the database, you can find the list of policies from some of the countries, and this is for China. So at the beginning, this is for 2020. So at the beginning, most of the policies are trying to help those mostly affected by COVID-19, but then at some time trying to recover economically. But I want to say that if you want to understand better the situations in China, you have to look at those policies which may appear firstly not for directly for economic recovery, because basically we experienced a rather short period for lockdown. Then most of the things back to normal and trying to continue. So most of the trends, especially from policy responses, actually you see the prevailing policy direction remain towards continued and deeper opening up, and also go greener. So that was already the situation before COVID-19. So if you look at the recent evaluation report of national environmental economic policies for 2020, that focus on 9 types of policies ranging from green finance to all kinds of tax instruments or carbon markets to emission markets. Then you see things have been continuing like this. And of course, we have to improve a lot of things, but there are major momentum to go, even to speed up these kind of trends. For example, this pledge from our President Xi that China will go for carbon neutrality by 2060. And immediately you see this year, the newly released 14th five-year planning, because that was the most important guideline for everything in China, at least for the immediate 5 years and for another 15 years long-term targets. So if you look at the structure of this kind of targets within this 5-year planning, then many of them are, how to say, this kind of ecological rationalities or environmental goals were embedded in different sectors and in different policy goals. And also very soon, by the end of this month, the world's biggest single carbon market will be online in China. So we are really implementing those things were already decided before COVID-19. Of course, behind this economic recovery, consumption played a very important role. Yeah, China was already a major consumption economy. This is the data from 2018. And within China, we have been observing this upward trends for consumption, both from the rural population and also from urban populations, and now even bigger. But if you look at the recent data for sharing economy, yeah, we mentioned that in the book, maybe sharing economy will be really decelerated. But look at these trends in China, basically 3 types of sharing economy, that is shared knowledge and skills, shared healthcare, and production capacity have been really accelerated. And the others is like life services, transportation, shared transportation, offices, accommodations were decelerated. But so far, I think because this is for the data up at the end of 2020, and if you look at this half year, situations have been changing. For example, shared bikes. This is a shared bikes coverage in Beijing, almost reached everywhere. So after the initial chaotic periods for shared bikes in China, because many investors into this market, but now everything come back in order and improved bikes and also management. So you see more people are engaged in using these shared bikes. Another one I want to focus, actually that was discussed basically in chapter 5 in the book about community or neighborhoods in their functions in enabling a kind of sustainable transition towards sustainable lifestyles. But it's really difficult to for those who have never been living in China to understand how communities are organized in China. So just to give you an idea, this is a map of Beijing, and in the center you will have the Forbidden City. Then the city was built around it. Now we are reaching the 6, actually 7 ring roads. And so the Forbidden City is the biggest courtyard in the city, and the other communities are organized in similar structure. The most important thing is when people had to stay at home during the lockdown, everything alive, most of the practices took place at community levels. So this review shows that the changes in governance measures and changes in the number of confirmed cases of COVID-19 during the lockdown period of last year actually highly coefficient. That means if measures were really enforced or implemented at community levels, then we are basically under control. With these pictures, I want to visualize a little bit. So this is a typical residential community in Beijing. Then you have several entrances. In case of necessity, you can have the gates with guards, so the mobility can be controlled. So that's what we did during the lockdown. And you have all kinds of public spaces and facilities for sharing, for different people, kids, and also organized at community level by volunteers, those activities trying to promote sustainable lifestyles, and also different actors from organizations, NGOs, social enterprises, and individuals are engaged in promoting this kind of lifestyles. And this is one of the typical theme park for households with the sorting as kind of demonstration projects, because since 1st of May last year in Beijing enforced this kind of household waste sorting regulation. So all the things were enforced by those organizations at the community level. And now we have the 1-year review. You see the participation rate increased a lot. And also, for example, the most important sorted food waste increased more than 11 times, and the sorted recyclable waste increased by almost half. And this kind of new facilities were installed in the different communities. At the beginning, we used many volunteers to supervise this kind of behaviors. And another question, of course, is what if we don't have these volunteers there? So people, if this kind of habits will become kind of routinized practices.
So can you finish in 1 minute, please?
Yeah, okay. So basically, this is one of the examples what we can really do very effectively at community levels. But you can also think about other forms of communities, virtual communities or platform-driven governance for different purposes. So this is the non-human agents played a role in with the sorting, but also other digital platforms to help people make a choice for green packaging when they order, and also for this kind of platforms driven change of mobilities, for green mobilities, and also for shopping online. If you get this kind of credits, you can have a tree in your name. All these kind of similar things in future will be very important, actually already developing very fast. So I hope to stop here for our discussions on this kind of innovative ways to enable sustainable transitions. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Lei. I will just take 2 minutes if you stop sharing your screen, Lei. So I'm sharing my screen for, okay. Let me skip my last remarks and let's open the floor for discussion. Halina, you are in charge. Okay, I saw.
Okay, now I am. I was muted. So you're not giving a presentation, right?
No.
Okay. Well, we have 2 questions waiting, but let me start the discussion with this observation in response to Valerie's presentation. So you are talking about the changes that that maybe are needed for the future. And what I see here is 3 different clocks that create a dilemma of these changes. So there are the economic changes, the way people and lifestyle changes are relatively fast, and you have observed that people, working remotely and so on. The political changes are slower, and you're talking about eliminating zoning for residential, separation of residential from commercial. And then there is the infrastructure where changes are absolutely the slowest, right? So how do we move forward when we have these entirely different 3 clocks? And the slowest clock is going to hold us back, right? The middle clock will also slow us, and the fast changes are requiring all these other slower clocks to move.
Would you like me to respond on that one?
Yes.
Okay. Absolutely. But the developers are not waiting for the government or the municipality. The developers are going ahead. They are part of the economics, so they're fast. The developers identify pretty quickly where the trends are going in household and residential, in property demand, and for office property. And the property market was reflecting all from the start, was beginning to reflect, hey, what's going on here? And then when it became clear that people were going to stay at home, the office property market started dropping, and the offices are empty. The most desirable ones have got their users back, but there are many office properties now in the less desirable, or they're in planning or proposals that they're not going to be implemented because there isn't the demand. And that's a very different situation to what happened before. So developers and the property market is making it very clear to the policy level, hey, you have to change. And they're already putting in proposals for residential in office building. They're already putting in proposals for changes in residential. So they're not waiting for the political or the infrastructure. They're doing it now. But absolutely, the political level and the infrastructure level, the question is, can we get the policy and the decision makers to take on the more sustainable directions and support the infrastructure? Let's get them getting public internet, fast internet infrastructure as a public service.
Yes.
I hope it will. I hope the policy makers will pick it up.
That's very interesting. So the government is going to ends up being the slowest, following the market and the changes in people. Very interesting. Okay, we had early on, Tom Abeles was responding to Fabian's presentation when you presented various trends occurring. And his comment was that maybe aggregate statistics are not really appropriate for understanding what's happening, because the COVID-related changes are different in each country and should be looked at separately. Would you like to comment on that, Fabian?
Sure. We actually use a lot of not so much aggregate data, although I think that there's two sides to the question. One that relates to the Sustainable Development Goals, and I agree with his understanding that these are like composite measures, aggregate measures that will strongly vary from one context to the other one. But it still is a good baseline for making a comparison in terms of in what direction was going the works towards that goal before COVID and after COVID. And in fact, that sensibility to the differences across across geographies that was behind our decision to focus on countries or situations that were out of focus back in May, June last year. So the book is mostly about the experiences from China, from Israel, and from Brazil, with some comparisons and with some examples coming from other latitudes. But definitely, for example, the way that digitalization impact education and enable education has an abysm when we compare what happened in Brazil, where it actually sharpened inequalities and was only a tiny minority that could profit from that education digitalized, to the US or to some Northern European countries. On the other side of the question is that we use very few aggregate indicators. For example, for mobility, we use both Google mobility maps and city mapper maps, which are done at the level of cities. And still, and in the case of Google mobility maps, it is disaggregated in terms of recreation purposes, work purposes, food provision purposes. So it still tells us.
Can you wrap up to allow more questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm done.
Okay. Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you. We have another question waiting, but I would like to ask a question to all of you. Thinking about this extremely strong role of community that Lei Zhang described in China, and it was very helpful in controlling the pandemic. And at the same time, Valerie is talking about people moving out, decentralizing, and the role of community may increase. So the question is, in a society like China, right, the culture is different from, let's say, US or Israeli society, which are very individualistic, stress individualism very strongly. Can we learn, can we adopt the elements of community organization that Lei described into these other societies? This is an open question for everybody. What?
Can I come in and comment on that one a minute?
Please.
Because Lei's experience was an eye-opener to me.
Yeah.
The Israeli experience was completely top-down, was completely implemented at the national level by the Ministry of Health. Some parts were good and some parts were disastrous. And Lei proposed that the policy is at national level, but the implementation is effective only if it is moved to the local level at designated down to what the Europeans call subsidiarity, that it would be down to the lowest level that can effectively operate it. And I think she's absolutely right, and it was a big mistake here. I think as soon as it went down to a more local level, when they started rolling out the vaccinations, the effectiveness of the system was much higher. So I think the concept that you should delegate authority for implementation to the lowest possible community, local levels, absolutely fascinating and very right.
Thank you. Thank you, Valerie. I think it's a very, very interesting learning process here.
So
for us.
Helena Ambreen also raised her hand several times.
Yeah, but I don't see her. I know she raised her hand, but I don't see her question. I've been looking for it. Yeah, it's not in the chat box and it's not in questions and answers.
You have to put your question in the chat box.
Yeah, yes. So let me, in the meantime, there is a question from Kai Hui's song to all panelists, what methods were used to translate behavioral changes to environmental sustainability indicators? So, you know, the translation, okay, we observe these behavioral changes and we interpret them in terms of sustainability. What methods were used to do that? Other than
I have a problem. I saw this question. I have a problem answering it. We would say, I think the question is absolutely right, but that we were looking at it as practitioners and what was happening on the ground, and we did not look at it in terms of a theoretical, conceptual, methodological way. So I would say that a follow-up now is needed, is to look at what has happened and a review in terms of a much more systematic and methodological way of looking at what we were and what is happening today. But I think we will run away from the question by saying we weren't trying to look at things in a methodological way.
Yeah, thank you.